Once upon a time, there was a boy who had never heard of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and he was the happiest boy in the world. The end. Ahoy, mateys! Welcome aboard the SS Storytime. I'm your swarthy captain, and you're my stalwart crew, and together we're on an interminable, Moby Dick-like odyssey to figure out the white whale that is MCU. In this installment, we're looking at the beloved and venerable Thor Ragnarok, a movie that reinvigorated everyone's least favorite Avenger simply by entirely rewriting his whole character. In doing so, the producers not only made a silly, non-impactful movie, but also squandered their one final shot at making an effective series. Oops! But it's okay because there's lots of funnies. In this video, we'll be talking about the baffling and unnecessary clownification of our main character, MCU's continuing failure to create a real story by focusing on trivialities, Marvel's stupid portrayal of masculinity throughout the series, plus more. Hold on to your hats, folks. Oh, sorry, your eye patches. Didn't mean to change the bit for no reason. We're gonna be going pretty hard on your favorite Thor movie and Hunt for the Wilder People Gateway. If you're not into that, you know what to do.
And don't come back!
Thor Ragnarok is a 2017 film directed by Taika Waititi. Perhaps now the most visible MCU director, who's not a sicko. You know him as the writer, director, actor behind formerly cult films like What We Do in the Shadows and Hunt for the Wilder People. He's also been involved with Flight of the Conchords and a lot of other New Zealand-based films and TV shows, and of course would go on to write and direct Jojo Rabbit and this year's Thor Thunder Love. The film was written not by Waititi, but by these guys, all of whom have pretty deep history with Marvel stuff, some of whom had written pretty extensively for superhero cartoons, and none of whom had any experience writing feature films, except for one who worked on this, which doesn't really count. So it's no wonder the finished movie is dripping with the kind of fast-moving but meaningless camp you'd expect in a children's cartoon, and is entirely inconsequential. Basically, the story is this. Thor has been having visions about Ragnarok, or the prophesied end of Asgard. He discovers Loki faked his death and has been posing as Odin for like 3 years, who has himself been in exile back on Earth. When Odin dies, Hela, Odin's secret real firstborn child, is released from her cosmic space jail so she can destroy Asgard or take over or something. Then Thor gets trapped on a gladiator planet where he meets up with Hulk. Then they do kick punches and destroy Asgard to stop Hela from destroying the true Asgard, which is the people of Asgard. Or something. Here are our characters. Thor. When we last saw Thor, he was setting out on a space mission to try and learn about and or track down more Xfinity Stones, having seen a vision in which bad stuff happens because of them. Rather than have this movie be, about that, we find he's basically given up on that quest because of Ragnarok or whatever. More importantly, we'd seen his character mature from an arrogant, thoughtless muscle man into a thoughtful, humble, though self-assured leader. However, the movie does a hard reset with him, and now he's mostly just a blustering buffoon, still a capable fighter concerned about others, but also mostly a fool and the butt of many jokes. We'll circle back. Hela. Hela is Odin's secret oldest child, with whom he did his colonialist conquests back in the day, but who he realized was a psychopath, so he locked her up in space jail. His death releases her, for some reason, and she sets out to finish what he started or whatever by taking over Asgard and then to move on to other worlds or something. She is made of infinite knives and is entirely outside of her mind. Loki. As we know, Loki has been masquerading as Odin since faking his death in Thor the Dark Elves.
You got the dud!
It is implied that his exile of Odin leads to the old man's death, somehow for which he never experiences any sort of consequences. Then he's just around for the rest of the movie, eventually helping stop Hela. We like him now, I guess. Bruce Banner. When last we saw Bruce, he was an uncooperative Hulk flying away in an Avenger jet from Sokovia. Then, rather than the next movie, address the fact that he was just missing without a trace, we all just kind of forgot about him until now when he shows up in a gladiator planet halfway across the galaxy somehow. Also, he's apparently Perma-Hulk for some reason, only de-hulking when he hears Natasha's voice inside the Avenger jet. For some reason. We learned that Bruce is afraid that if he goes Hulk again, he won't ever come back, since this time Hulk apparently had more control for some reason. Thor is pretty dismissive of this, and then Bruce goes Hulk to fight a giant demon dog anyway, and everybody's fine with that. I guess because Hulk is funny and Bruce is a science nerd, the story doesn't know what to do with since it's never given him an actual story. It's fine. It's not like he's the only character in the series with any sort of internal conflict. We don't need to explore that. We can just have clouds punching stuff instead. Lady. Thor gets captured by a lady on the Gladiator planet. She definitely has a name that we definitely learn. She's also a drunken wreck because she used to be a Valkyrie until she had to fight Hela and everyone she knew got killed or something. So she went to the Gladiator planet to drink and enslave people for money for thousands upon thousands of years. Don't worry, she has an abrupt off-screen change of heart and helps Thor fight Hela, becoming MCU's 7th black or brown sidekick, and Thor's 2nd. Someday. In addition to our main crew, we've got Jeff Goldblum, Korg the Rock Guy, the original black sidekick leading the Resistance, Judge Dredd, Odin who was killed by the plot first thing, Doctor Strange, and... not Jane, Thor's one true love.
Oh, my one true love.
She apparently dumped him off screen at some point for a real reason we get to know about that matters very much to the story and to their characters. Marvel loves women.
It's not you, Millhouse. I just don't plan to ever get married.
The overall vibe of the film can best be described as whatever, just roll with it. The jettisons basically all serious elements that had been in play in both MCU and Thor's other movies, apparently assuming that audiences wouldn't mind a hard reset this late in the game. And to their credit, it seems like producers guessed right on this. Ragnarok was by far the most successful Thor movie in the series to that point, in terms of both box office and audience reception. I don't think this tonal shift is solely the doing of Taika Waititi, though the film is certainly covered in his fingerprints. In fact, comparing it with his other work, I'm not sure this film has as much to do with him as everybody kind of thinks. See, the rest of his work always has some kind of sincere beating heart at its core, and isn't afraid to get a little serious when it needs to, but Thor Ragnarok actively backflips away from seriousness at every opportunity. Moments like Odin's death are dispensed with as quickly as possible. Remember the slow-mo funeral scene for Thor's mother, a character who wasn't even a character? And Hela's genocidal tendencies are dismissed with jokes. Though, to be fair, she's not the first person a Thor movie has done this with. The whole thing, even though it ends with the destruction of Asgard, feels so trivial, and that has only the film's flippant tone to thank for it. Don't get me wrong, Waititi knows how to use such a tone to make really good comedy, but here it feels like someone just kind of doing a lazy impression of him. I don't know, maybe he got to Marvel, saw he wouldn't have any real say in anything anyway, and went, well, whatever, just roll with it. I'd like to talk a little more about the hard refresh Marvel did with this movie. Why they did it, why it was so terrible in execution, and why it undermines their overall plans for the series. You know, nothing too major. Let's cast our minds back to the first two Thor movies. For some reason, these films have never really been viewed by most fans and critics as good. I mean, I've already spent an hour talking about why these movies aren't good, so you're not going to get any pushback from me on that account other than to say that these movies really aren't any better or worse than most of MCU. But the point remains. Think about it. How many people do you know whose favorite Marvel movie is Thor 1 or Thor the Dark Elves? For that matter, how many people do you know whose favorite Avenger was Thor from that period?
Nobody likes Millhouse!
Probably some. I mean, he was pretty hot. But it still feels like the Dark Horse second choice people forget for a minute, then like, oh yeah. As I've talked about before, I'm not sure why these movies have the reputation they do, especially compared to other MCUs. I would say they actually probably do a better job of developing their main character than like your Captain Americas and your Iron Men, even if their villains are no less silly than what we get elsewhere. There's that interesting Thor, Loki, will they, won't they dynamic. There's the only real romantic relationship in all of MCU. And there's jokes. I don't know, maybe it's the heightened Wagnerian operatic atmosphere of Asgard, which, to be fair, doesn't exactly exude funness. Or maybe Uncle Moneybags was just bored with them, and Guardians of the Galaxy did really good despite not being anything other than candy-colored gag reels. And that felt easier than making a dramatic story that completes Thor's journey before the final showdown of the series. Yes, if Kevy has other storytelling tools than pandering and laziness, I don't know what they are.
They figured out the words and the phrases they can use to pander to their audience, and they list the same words and phrases off sort of Mad Lib style in every...
At any rate, the decision is made to liven up Thor, which is fine, and possible to do without breaking the story world he's inhabited for 6 years. Here's my pitch. Jane makes some kind of discovery about Xfinity Stones since, she's like a science lady, and so she and Darcy join Thor on his quest around the galaxy, which so far he's had no luck with. He and Jane have a kind of Empire Strikes Back bickering sexual tension thing since Thor is in and out of her life and she's frustrated about it. And Darcy's there to be C-3PO and interrupt their romancing and be annoying, and they visit many crazy and colorful worlds and have a grand old time getting up to hijinks. But ultimately they uncover a serious story about the Xfinity Stones. Derivative, yes, but this is Marvel, guys. No one's gonna care. In this version, we have a rollicking, fun adventure where Thor and Jane can resolve their relationship and stuff. Instead, we get a story about nothing that has nothing to do with anything that's happened already, featuring an entirely new character coincidentally named Thor, and contributing nothing productive to the series going forward. Never underestimate the power of a lazy, pandering man in charge.
A dirt road, a cold beer, a blue jeans, or...
Let me be clear, Thor in this movie just doesn't work. He's reduced to little more than a dumb, clownish jock with a good heart. Another Andy running around getting into shenanigans. He's a caricature of a hero, an SNL parody of himself.
Now I'm at like an 11. I'm cranked up. Woo!
Isn't it funny when he tries to be all manly and God of Thundery and all that happens is a couple of little sparks? It's funny because he has such an ego, but he's really just a big kid playing at being a grown-up, so it kind of cuts him down to size, which he apparently needs.
Jay, my new film is a mix of action and comedy. It's called McBain. Let's get silly.
The problems with Thor's new characterization are these. It ignores everything that has happened before, making it irrelevant. It undermines everything that has happened before, making it meaningless. And it makes everything that happens in this movie feel trivial. Here's an example. Old Thor was vainglorious, arrogant, sometimes cruel, generally thoughtless, and pretty entitled. These traits are justified in him by him being a god with pretty powerful powers. Obviously, these aren't super wonderful traits, and so his first 2 movies do a lot of work to help him develop out of them and become his best self. By getting involved with Earth affairs and meeting Jane, Thor learns about worthiness and what it means to be a real leader. Great! New Thor is vain, proud, and generally thoughtless, but just in a harmless, jockey, adolescent way. It's not meant to be something to develop out of, it's just meant to look silly since he is a big, strong man who can't summon his mojo. This effectively erases whatever development the character had in other movies, making those stories meaningless and irrelevant. Take that, Kenneth Branagh.
Hear that subtle mandolin? That's textbook pandering.
Allow a comparison. In Thor 1, Thor loses the ability to wield his hammer because he has been deemed unworthy. Viewing it as the source of his power, Thor is upset and frustrated and so sets about getting the hammer back, which in turn leads to him learning stuff and growing as a character. On a plot level, Thor's desire to get the hammer back leads to conflict and growth, and therefore a story. In Ragnarok, Thor also loses his hammer. This time it's much worse, it's actually destroyed by his demon sister. But Thor's reaction is... well, we never really see it. The closest we get is a little bit of reminiscing with Korg the Rock Guy, but that immediately turns into weird sex jokes.
No, stop. Think of the children.
The plot is more motivated by his desire to save Asgard, but the movie's attitude toward the hammer, that it's basically a joke, not unlike Thor himself, makes everything else in the movie feel trivial. Like, if it doesn't matter to Thor, I have no reason to care about his hammer. And Thor is not the only source of silliness. The other major one is Hela, who on paper is the world-ending villain, but who on screen vacillates between schlock, camp, and outright, well, silliness, none of which is actually menacing.
Did you ever notice how men always leave the toilet seat up? That's the joke.
You suck, McBain!
On the one hand, she's the rare Marvel villain who seems to delight in being bad. She was treated pretty poorly by Odin, but you get the sense that she's not really in it for revenge. She just likes conquering stuff and killing people.
Fights are fun. I like fights.
From a story perspective, this isn't like the most solid motivation, but it's at least different from what we've already seen in MCU. But also, the story doesn't really take her seriously. It seems aware of her over-the-topness even as she's doing terrible things, and there are multiple instances where not only the audience but other characters are meant to laugh at her, not because she had a deliciously evil and quippy one-liner, but because she makes some kind of flub, which is basically the opposite of what you want to do if you want your story to have any stakes.
Let's get silly.
A comedy like Zoolander is allowed to have a villain who's a joke. A Marvel movie where a planet gets destroyed, not so much. Speaking of, even the destruction of Asgard gets jokes. Remember when the giant fire demon is doing his thing and we might want to feel sad that Thor has had to make this choice in order to save his people, and then Hulk just jumps in like a giant flea to fight the big monster and then complains like a child when he's told not to, and it's funny because he's acting like he's 6. Nothing matters in this movie because it has invalidated everything from previous movies and replaced that material with silliness for its own sake. This, friends, is what it means to jump the shark. To sacrifice the credibility of an entire series or franchise for the sake of a single, not that good gag. But it's funny, I guess, so whatever.
No, on second thoughts, let's not go to Camelot. It is a silly place.
Let's talk about the other big reason why Thor Ragnarok is a stupid movie. It helps screw up the whole series.
Ooh, sorry.
You may remember, though you'd be forgiven for forgetting, that the MCU has a major series villain, a being called Thanos. We now know that his thing was to use the Infinity Stones to eliminate half the people in the universe for some reason. We also know that there are 20 movies between the time that the series begins with Iron Man in 2008 and his story is concluded in Avengers Endgame in 2019. That's like 800 hours of movie. His first appearance is a quick stinger in Avengers The Avengers, which means that going back as far as 2012, Kevin and company knew he was going to be the big bad, which of course explains why, save for a couple of other meaningless cameos, they did nothing to really introduce Thanos until 2018 in Avengers Infinity War, at which point he was already causing mayhem, meaning it was going to be hard to characterize him and make him feel compelling or scary in any way. The people who make these movies are hacks.
The film is just me in front of a brick wall for an hour and a half. It cost $80 million.
I've come down hard on Marvel in the past for dropping this ball. In fact, I've called how the Thanos material was handled in Guardians of the Galaxy the single greatest mistake in a series made almost entirely of mistakes.
The worst episode ever.
Marvel doubled down on the problem by not including Thanos in Guardians 2 when they very easily could have, and now has tripled down on it by not including him in Thor Ragnarok, their last opportunity to do so. You might be wondering, why would he show up in a Thor movie? Thanos doesn't have anything to do with Thor. Well, for starters, we know Thor was going to be looking for Infinity Stones. Feels like the natural thing for the plot of this movie to be centered around Thor trying to find them and learn about them.
You'd like to think that, wouldn't you?
Since we've blown 2 opportunities to introduce Thanos on a character level, the least we could do to lay some groundwork for Infinity War is to let Thor meet him in this movie. So, Thanos, a guy we're supposed to be afraid of, not Hela, a nobody we've never heard of, can destroy Thor's hammer in their first meeting, before he even has any stones. Imagine what he could do when he gets his hands on any! Then in the climax, the destruction of Asgard can be caused by Thanos as he's escaping or something, meaning we already have concern for when he eventually makes it to Earth. Let's revisit my pitch from earlier. The first couple of acts can be more hijinks related. Thor and Jane could even have a detour on the Gladiator planet and pick up Hulk and the other lady. But then the third act, things get serious when they discover Thanos is heading to Asgard to collect the Tesseract Blue Stone kept in the vault next to the Eternal Flame.
Is this burning an eternal flame?
They find the place undefended because Loki has been being Odin, so after being unable to fight Thanos effectively, Thor has to decide to bring about Ragnarok in order to keep Thanos from getting the stone, and take the surviving Asgardians to the ship to freedom. Now, not only can Thor and Jane resolve their relationship, but Thor can fulfill his arc as a leader of his people, and we finally get to set up our series' big, bad final villain, at least a little. Knowing Thanos to be in hot pursuit, we've also now got a sense of narrative urgency for what will happen next. Is he gonna catch him? Where are they gonna go? It still doesn't solve the biggest Thanos issue, him loving Gamora, but something is better than nothing.
Something.
Instead, we just get a silly Villain of the Week episode with absolutely nothing to do with the main story, which by now will be coming to an end pretty soon. Honestly, the narrative impact of keeping Thanos out of the picture until essentially Infinity War is the same as if he were introduced in Infinity War, which makes him no more than another Villain of the Week. We know nothing about him except for a few scraps here and there, which we've forgotten anyway since they were revealed to us years ago. It's hard for me to express how truly lazy and downright incompetent the macro storytelling is in this series. If I were Kevy, and capable of shame, I would be embarrassed to have my name on it.
How do you sleep at night?
Have you ever noticed there are a lot of guys in MCU? Yep, MCU is full of guys. To this point in the series, all of MCU's major heroes have been men, with the possible exception of Natasha Romanoff, Gamora, and now Valkyrie Lady, but they're all kind of sidekicks, so I don't know if they count. And I guess technically Agent Carter did get her own TV show, even though she never did anything in the movies, so good for her. Basically, this means that we've seen a lot of guys supposedly being cool heroes and stuff. I know I've talked a lot about how much Marvel loves its female characters, but we haven't really talked that much about the men. And since a lot of people seem to think Thor Ragnarok does a really good job of lampooning some of the toxic male traits many superheroes tend to exhibit, now felt like as good a time as any to look at how MCU portrays masculinity. It does it real bad. Thanks everyone for watching, be sure to like and subscribe and stick around. But seriously, MCU's portrayal of heroic manliness is lacking, for the same reasons as everything else in MCU is lacking. Laziness and bad writing! One of the virtues of having a series of a million movies mostly featuring men as the heroes could be providing audiences, especially male audiences, with a variety of cool, healthy, non-toxic models of masculinity on which they can base their own behavior. What kinds of role models can boys find in MCU? Well...
Doug! What is not a damn thing?
Tony Stark is rich, entitled, stubborn, and misogynistic. Everything is easy for him since he is a genius born with the world's largest silver spoon in his mouth, a fact he takes a weird pride in, making him disdainful of the achievements of others. He is dedicated to protecting people, but that usually means by controlling them. Remember the murder robots he created?
Crush, kill, destroy.
Don't!
He also has a soft spot for underdogs, but does a really terrible job mentoring them. Remember Spider-Man? He's more of a throw money at the problem kind of guy than engage with people on a personal level kind of guy. Steve Rogers is entitled, stubborn, and misogynistic, but in a different way. He's more of a most girls can't do things kind of guy, where Tony is a girls or pleasure units guy.
Mrs. Donner wanted to go along, naturally, but Donner said, "No, this is man's work."
It's a spectrum. He is dedicated to protecting people, but that usually means by controlling them, by being in charge and forcing others to adopt his views, which tend toward fascism. He doesn't like bullies, but only because he thinks it's his right to be in charge. He's more of a punch the problem till it stops kind of guy than a use my words to solve problems kind of guy. Scott Lang is entitled, stubborn, and dishonest. He does have a sincere love for his daughter, which is great, but his way of expressing that is to not follow the rules society and his ex have given him and instead do his own thing, which is funner and also puts her in unnecessary danger. Barton has that thing of where his perceived duty is more important than the safety and well-being of his family, who he never chooses first.
There's a lot to be said for the army, the life without responsibility.
Remember how he's in water prison for helping a war criminal prosecute his agenda while his wife is at home with their kids, including presumably a newborn? Dad of the year. As we recently discussed, Peter Parker is entitled, stubborn, and obsessed with himself. He constantly seeks the approval of others to the point that this appears to be his main motivation for being Spider-Man. But he's a teenager, so I guess it's okay for him to not be a saint. But also he is the worst. Stephen Strange is arrogant, entitled, and emotionally abusive to his friends and romantic partners. He is also incredibly dismissive of rules, thinking himself above them. Rather than become powerful by leaving his ego behind, his magic seems to have only just given it a new channel to thrive in. Peter Quill is arrogant, selfish, and misogynistic in the classic Tony Stark kind of way. He is also dismissive of rules and social structures, and often behaves very terribly to his friends. He also puts a child in his care in harm's way, constantly. All of these men resort to violence of some form or other to solve their problems and to exert their will over others.
Fights are fun. I like fights.
They are often unconcerned about collateral damage and express little to no remorse about their actions when things go wrong. Of the men who are sidekicks, unwavering loyalty is mostly their thing, which is not in itself an issue, except for when the guys you're loyal to are terrible people. The only two possible exceptions of non-terrible male role models in these movies are Bruce Banner and T'Challa. Bruce is a scientist, and while his research into gamma radiation wasn't unproblematic, he is essentially a victim to it. That said, he is party to developing the murder robots in Age of Ultron, so we'll put him in the maybe pile. And of course, T'Challa has not been in his own movie yet, but he is the only Avenger so far to not use violence to achieve his ends. After he gets over wanting to avenge his father's murder, he brings the responsible party to actual non-murder justice and offers his home as a sanctuary to someone who he had recently considered his enemy. So, 1 out of like 15 ain't bad. Which brings us to Thor, who up until recently might have made it onto the nice list. Of course, he started out as a colonialist enforcer who fought and killed with pleasure, but as I stated earlier, by the end of his second movie he is well on his way to becoming a wise, humble leader, not using his god status as a means of controlling or subjugating others, like certain other Avengers might. He's even come to terms with his maniac brother, far from the worst thing a buff guy in charge could be as far as role models go. But this movie, as I've said, gets rid of all that, replacing it with a really not great version of Thor.
Let's get silly.
This one doesn't plan things, instead relying on a kind of Panglossian everything will work out attitude, even if it means the deaths of a lot of people. He is still fairly selfless, working the whole movie to get back to Asgard to save his people, but he's pretty manipulative about getting Bruce, Hulk, and Valkyrie Lady to go with him. He's also incredibly vain, a thing he's been before, but which here I think is worse. Old Thor wouldn't care at all what people from Earth thought about him since he is compared with them basically a god. But here he has this thing about being the strongest Avenger. It's meant to be a joke to take some of the starch out of the big He-Man stereotype, but it reveals new Thor to be really just incredibly petty. There is a world where the men of MCU could portray a kaleidoscope of healthy masculinities. People who serve the best interest of others, who work together to solve problems, who don't resort to violence, at least as much as possible given that these are comic book movies, who treat women inclusively and with respect, who are able to maintain stable relationships, and who aren't petty, vainglorious peacocks who measure their virility by how many kick punches they do. Of course, that's the world where Kevy and the producers and writers of these movies actually work hard on them, another manly quality largely absent from these characters. Marvel loves men? Yeah, it's time for other things about Thor Ragnarok that are stupid or lazy or don't make sense. 1. No one remembers Hela, which doesn't make sense. See, she is Odin's firstborn, and they had a good old time conquering people and consolidating the 9 realms and stuff. Obviously, it makes sense that he would seek to hide her identity after putting her in space jail, but what about all the people who were alive when those conquests happened? Did they just all swear to never talk about her again? Or was everyone who is alive on Asgard now born after Hela's banishment? Were Hela and Odin and the Valkyrie the only people on Asgard? 2. I guess now I think of it, does Odin's family, live longer than the rest of the Asgardians? He's the All-Father, whatever that means. His wife was a goddess of something, I think. Thor is the god of thunder, Loki is god of mischief, and Hela is goddess of death. Does that make them live longer than the plebeians? It's just weird to me that at no point is someone like, oh yeah, I've heard stories about Hela, she was the crazy lady. 3. What do gods in this world do? Thor doesn't cause or direct the natural phenomenon of thunder, he just uses thunder powers. So maybe it's not a Greek thing where Thor could stop doing his job and there'd be no more thunder or whatever. He's just named after it because he is a god who wields thunder power? So if that's the case, what does it mean for Hela to be the goddess of death? It's clear she doesn't control the death process or even harness it as a power. I mean, she resurrects some zombie soldiers, but she uses the eternal flame. And she can herself die. Seems like she should be the goddess of knives since she has infinity of them. I don't know, it's possible this movie and its underlying mythology wasn't very well thought out. 4. How long do Asgardians live? If you'll remember, there is one Asgardian who remembers Hela, the Valkyrie lady Thor meets on the Gladiator planet. Even if Thor was born the day after Hela's banishment, Valkyrie lady would have been old enough to, be a Valkyrie and fight and stuff, so shouldn't she be a lot older than Thor? Maybe not as old as Odin, but not in her 30s. And wouldn't that mean she's been on the Gladiator planet for many thousands of years since Thor is no spring chicken himself? Wouldn't you get tired of catching people to fight for you and drinking and being terrible? I mean, I'm sure she felt a lot of grief and guilt about being the only one who didn't get killed, but she's acting like it was a few years ago, not millennia. Guys, your script is broken. 5. Hulk takes a Quintjet into space all the way to the Gladiator planet. So at no point before do we see these jets attempt space travel. They're like fancy F-16s, but apparently they can create the kind of velocity to not only make it out of Earth's orbit, but also travel across the galaxy. Now we do see that the Gladiator planet is the depository for a bunch of, wormholes, so presumably Hulk came through one of these, which is fine, but that means that the other end of it would basically have to have been in the space between Earth and the moon. Otherwise, Hulk would have suffocated long before reaching it. And I don't know, all of that feels a little improbable to me, given the no work that goes into justifying it in the script. Whatever, just roll with it. 6. Good thing Korg the Rock Guy picked a general transport ship every bit as fancy and indestructible as the state-of-the-art cruiser ship Thor had to take through the devil's anus. 7. Oh no, our favorite stereotype fighters got promptly and unceremonially killed. Except for Lady Fighter, I guess, who didn't want to be in the movie or something. Marvel loves women. 8. Hulk can, talk now in sentences. So that's cool, we learned how he could do that. 9. Let's talk about the hammer's worthiness requirement again. As you'll remember, in Thor 1, Odin pronounced Thor unworthy of it, which meant he could not pick it up or wield it. By learning to be not a bad person, he became worthy of it again, possibly by the will of Odin, but honestly, I can't remember. I don't think it matters, though. Since then, other Avengers have tried to pick it up, and to no avail. It's like Sword of the Stone or something. In this movie, Hela can hold it and then destroys it. So the question is, what is the hammer's worthiness thing based on? Is it just people who Odin says can wield it? If so, I guess millennia in space jail didn't annul Hela's ability to hold the hammer. Or does the hammer have its own sort of sentience? In which case, why on earth does it allow Hela to hold it? Or do her powers somehow transcend the worthiness thing? If so, how and why? And shouldn't we want to know more about that, since that means Thor is actually pretty vulnerable now? But why would we want an explanation for significant powers like this when we can just not have it instead? It's not like it might have implications down the road or anything. Whatever. I guess that's it. At the end of the day, Thor Ragnarok is just another mediocre entry into MCU. This, of course, isn't surprising so much as disheartening, given how much people like it. Because apart from the jokes, most of which really aren't that good. Have you rewatched this movie? This movie has nothing going on for it other than a kind of weird veneer. It doesn't do anything meaningful with Thor's character, besides, turning him into Brad from your high school football team, nor does it contribute anything to the series as a whole. In fact, it goes out of its way to ignore the series of which it is a part so that it can have its fun. The moment Thor lands on the garbage gladiator planet is the moment the MCU jumps the shark. Any possible credibility it might have had finally vanishes, for we can see now that the people in charge no longer have a grip on the story they're telling. And that grip was only ever feeble to begin with, but now it is proven conclusively that they don't care about it. All they care about is getting you to show up, which for them is easier to do if they just throw some low-impact jokes at you rather than commit to the story they're presumably set out to tell. It's lazy, and it's pandering, and it's all the series is good for.
Y'all dumb mother want a key change, thematically meandering, emphatically pandering.
Anyway, thanks for watching. Be sure to tune in next time. We'll be looking at Black Panther, the MCU movie that comes the closest to actually being about stuff, though sadly it's not. Good night.
How do you sleep at night?
On top of a pile of money with many beautiful ladies.